So how long have I got, roughly?
20 minutes?
20 minutes? Okay. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been to New Jersey before. I actually lived in New York for a number of years. And I love the whole place, so it's great to have an excuse to come back here. After a career in business, as Brian said, and I'm still involved a little bit with things like Christina, I'd always wanted to be a writer. I had a long checkered career. I was a lawyer, I was a banker, I went into business working for other people, and then eventually I had my own business, and that's where I got my board, a computer business, which we sold to NCR in the 2001-2002. And as I'd always wanted to write, but been too busy, I thought, having sold the company and got some means out of that, I had no option but to get on with it and start writing. And I chose to write about World War II for a number of reasons. My parents lived through the war. My father was in the Navy. My mother was a teenager and then had her first job in the war. And she used to tell me all these great stories, which struck me as interesting in the sense that somehow one thinks sometimes about World War II London, that everything was just so, you know, like those pictures, those movies with Mrs. Miniver, with Greer Garson and Walter Pigeon. Everyone was so terribly nice, valiantly battling against Hitler and trying to, you know, keep everything calm.
Can you come forward?
Come forward a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Here.
You're so far back.
Okay, all right. So things were not like they show in Mrs. Miniver. The war was interesting for my mother's stories because she told me about things that were part of ordinary life being lived, and ordinary life went on. You know, people dated, married, had kids, had businesses to run, got into trouble, argued, borrowed money they shouldn't borrow, and above all else, crime. They committed crime, and crime in World War II London boomed between 1939 and 1945. Crime in England and Wales, reported crime, rose by 60%. So I was researching. First of all, I was interested in World War II London because of all these old stories my mother had told me of travelling up to London. She worked for the railway, and she got free passes, so she would go up to London from South Wales and go dancing, and she met quite a few American officers along the way. I don't know the exact details, but I said, but Mum, when you went up there, wasn't London being bombed? She said, oh yes, we didn't care about that, we just went and had fun. So people ignored a lot of the bad things that were going on, but meanwhile, criminals had a wonderful time. And why did they have a wonderful time? First of all, we had the blackout. Is everyone familiar with the blackout? Yeah. Okay, so if you went out at night, there was no light. So that was obviously great for criminals. Secondly, various cities, London most importantly, had the Blitz. And the Blitz was on and off all the way through the war. The chaos that was caused drew on police time, and that was another factor that made it easier for criminals to go about their business. Another factor is we had the government imposed all sorts of restrictions to do with the war, most famously rationing of food, clothing and petrol. And this in itself offered opportunities to criminals, forgery, theft, and so on. So it was really a whole new area of crime that was opened up by the restrictions that were imposed. And another factor was the police were being denuded of good officers because people were joining up in the army. So all of those factors contributed to crime booming. And A, I had been interested just generally in World War II, but B, I just realized this is a really good time in which to set a detective fiction series. So I created my character, DCI, Detective Chief Inspector Frank Merlin. And Frank Merlin's background, he's about in his early 40s when the first in the series starts. So I've written 3 books. The first one is called Prince's Gate, set in January 1940. And it's about murders at the American Embassy, and the ambassador at that time was Joe Kennedy, so there's an American angle in that story. The second book is Stalin's Gold, which is set at the time of the Battle of Britain. And the third one, Merlin At War, is set in June 1941, which is just after the Battle of Crete and just before Hitler invaded Russia. So Frank Merlin, he's in his early 40s. His background, his father was a Spanish sailor who ended up landing in London and marrying an English girl. He's a widower. His wife died recently before the book started. He's charismatic, he's good looking like me. No, he's completely different from me. He's tall, dark and handsome, and just my aspiration probably. And he has a few quirks. He loves poetry. He likes eating these terrible menthol lozenges, which I think you can buy here, called Fisherman's Friends. And but he's a good guy, and he's a good detective. And he would like to go and join up in the army, but he's not allowed to do it. You fought your bit in the First World War, Frank. You've got to stay here. So that's the series of my books. In my books, what I try to do is, obviously I have fictional stories, but I try to give them as authentic a background as I can. And in that context, I research a great deal. And usually it's my research that gives me the idea for the plots. So, do you mind if I sit down a bit? Because I've got a slight bad back. As Brian knows, I was in a function the other day and I got a bit wobbly. It's not because I've been on the whiskey first thing. I'll try and speak up loud enough so everyone can hear at the back. Anyway, what I would like to do now is just tell you a few interesting facts about crime in World War II, because I think some of them you will find quite shocking. If I can find the right page. So the first thing I want to talk about is looting. People don't really think that looting existed in World War II. There was a huge amount of looting. In the 4 months between September and December 1940, the Old Bailey, which is the major criminal court in London, dealt with over 4,000 cases of looting. And the looting wasn't just criminals getting involved, it was ordinary people, and even more shockingly, it was members of the rescue forces. The air raid wardens, firemen, even police people were caught looting. So that is one of the major things that offers a writer ideas. The most shocking event that I've read about, there was a nightclub in London, it still exists actually in a different format, called the Café de Paris. And it was a very posh nightclub. It had a direct hit from the German bombs. Hundreds of people were killed. When the rescue forces arrived, they had to struggle to get the bodies out because so many people were fighting to tear the jewelry and rings off the fingers and necks of the dead bodies. So, not Walter Pidgeon and Greer Garson. Obviously, with the blackout and the chaos, killers and murderers had a field day. One such was Gordon Cummins, who was a man who liked to kill young girls and mutilate them. And he did this, found several victims in 1941, 1942, before he was eventually caught and hanged, and he acquired the sobriquet of the Blackout Ripper. Another murderer who took advantage of the conditions of the war was Harry Dobkins. Because there was so much bombing going on, people thought, he thought anyway, that he could cover up the murder of his wife, who he strangled, by setting her body in a bombed out building, and therefore if anyone found her they would think that she had died in the bombing. Unfortunately, a year later the body was buried in such a way that it was well preserved, and a year later when it was found and analysed, the doctor was clever enough to find out that he could see that she'd been strangled. But it does raise the question how many people got away with crimes like that. There must have been probably scores of people who did that and got away completely innocently. Rationing, as I mentioned, offered plenty of opportunity for criminals. One example of how much money could be made in criminality in this area, one gang in the north of England was found out to have stolen 14,000 newly issued clothing ration books, and they sold them on the black market, and they made a profit of £70,000, which in those days was the equivalent of £3 million or $4 million today. So there was a lot of money to be made. And another case, the going rate for a forged clothing coupon on the streets of London was $13 equivalent, or $520 today. So people made a lot of money. And in terms of circumventing the rules, obviously there were ordinary people who could be corrupted by the whole experience. People, because there was food rationing, people on farms would illegally supply their produce to a black market dealer. And so ordinary people were rolled into the corruption that existed around all these areas. In terms of the black market, we had gangs in London during the war, and there were British Cockney gangs, there were Maltese gangs, there were Italian gangs, and they all had a great time in the war. The one gang that dominated the London black market was run by someone called Billy Hill, who was lucky enough, despite his 30 years as a gangster, to retire quietly and write his memoirs many years later. But he did that after he'd mentored a couple of brothers called the Krays. I don't know if anyone here heard of the Krays here? The Krays were like the biggest criminals, our equivalent of your biggest mafia guys. And so he led them into crime. Another area that boomed, vice. If you can just imagine, in 1944, before D-Day, there were 3 million people in uniform from Britain on the home front, and 1.4 million GIs. Now, every so often these guys would be allowed to go out and try and get some fun, and there were certain types of fun which they would pay a lot for and which people provided. And the prostitution and vice gangs were run by a Maltese gang called the Messinas, and they had a huge number of prostitutes who were known as the Piccadilly Commandos. Con men flourished during the war, not only on the black market, but there are all sorts of other dodgy scams. For example, if you didn't want to go and join the army, you could get a medical exemption. Someone would give you a certificate. All you had to do is find a corrupt doctor who you would pay, and he would give you a dodgy certificate, and you would get off. That was a booming business. There were all sorts of building scams. Obviously, there was a huge amount of civil construction in the war, things like air raid shelters and so on. And corrupt officials had to certify that the buildings were up to scratch. They would be paid off. Shoddy material would go into the building, and people would die. So there were there was a case in Hammersmith in London where the air raid shelters all collapsed completely during a bombing raid. Scores of people died, and that was all due to the corruption and the dodgy contractor. One of the scams I always find quite shocking is there were a lot of people in London and Britain who were refugees from Europe. A lot of Jewish people who'd escaped the Nazis. There were lots of people who'd escaped from Stalin and so on. And all of them usually had terrific experiences with people like the Gestapo and so on. And they were petrified of anyone in a uniform. Some of these people did manage to get to Britain and have wealth. And the gangs of con men would identify them, dress up as policemen. One group would go and say, look, you've got to come with us. The family would be removed somewhere outside London, and the other half of the gang will go in and clean the house out. So terrible, terrible stuff, but good stuff for fiction. It's not in my books yet, but it might be. And there were other monsters who found the war conditions, the lack of information, the records would be lost in bombing. There was a murderer called John Christie who gained some fame in that he sent an innocent man to his death for his crimes. It was made into a book and a film starring Richard Attenborough, if anyone's seen it. During the war, he was a special constable because it had not been discovered that he had many criminal acts before, but the records had just gone, and that made it easier for him to commit all sorts of terrible murders. From an American perspective, how am I doing for time? Am I okay? Another 5 minutes? Okay. Unusually, American soldiers were not subject to UK law or the legal system. There were American courts which the American Army insisted they set up and they ran. And they ran quite well, and they set them up all around the country. But over time, there was disquiet in the public because certain facts became better known. And the principal facts were that black soldiers were much more likely to be prosecuted for crimes. And in the event that they were convicted, they would get much longer sentences or tougher sentences than white soldiers. And there was one particular case, a guy called Leroy Henry, who was a black soldier in the west of England, and he allegedly raped someone. There was very skimpy evidence, but the penalty for rape in the American courts was hanging. So he was sentenced to hang, and the people of Bath and the newspapers created a big ruckus. There was a petition of 30,000 people asking for clemency, and Eisenhower had to step in and give him a pardon and put him back in the army because it was such a major event. So, I think what I'll just do there is all of these things give me ideas, and what also gives me ideas is developments internationally. When I was writing Merlin at War, one of the interesting things I read was that, which I didn't know about, was that in June 1941, May, June 1941, Allied forces were invading Syria. And I thought that's a rather strange thing happening compared with what's happening now. And the situation with Syria was run by the Vichy French, which was the part of France which Hitler allowed to run on his terms. And if you've seen Casablanca, it's the same deal. You know, Casablanca and Morocco were the same thing, run by the Vichy. And so that gave me an idea for a plot line in my book. I mentioned vice was booming. Well, sexual activity boomed because people thought they might die. People became much more relaxed about these things, so illegal abortions proliferated. That gave me another idea for my current book. And the idea of Vichy, which I then went into, General de Gaulle was just setting up the Free French forces in Britain, and I thought there would be an interesting exploration of the attitudes of the Free French and Vichy and espionage and so on. So that's how I do it. That's what crime is all about. Going back to the history, obviously in 1945, Hitler's defeat brought an end to the blackout and the bombing, and conditions became less congenial for criminals, although rationing continued till the early 50s, so there was still plenty of scope in that area. But of course, crime carried on. A few years back, there was a criminal who gained some notoriety. He'd been one of the Cray gang. He was a vicious criminal, but he wrote his memoirs, and he was on the TV quite a lot, and people called him a character. And I remember seeing the interview myself where he was talking about World War II London, and he said in a Cockney accent, which I won't attempt, I'll never forgive that Hitler bloke giving up in the war. We were having such a great time, why didn't he just carry on? Because the period was a golden time for crime, and it's a golden time for Frank Merlin to investigate. So, thank you.